We're going to be taking a look at macromolecules. But before we do that, we need to talk about the importance of carbon. So if you remember, which four elements are organisms mostly made of? So hopefully you remembered HONC. So remember that organisms are mostly made out of hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. And carbon is going to be really important for these macromolecules because carbon is going to form the backbone of all of the macromolecules. And remember, macromolecules are just large molecules. And we're talking about things like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And these are going to be found in all of our cells. And the carbon that is in all the macromolecules in our bodies, actually where all of that carbon comes from is actually from our food. So that's where we get all of our carbon from. Okay, so carbon is actually very versatile and can form a wide variety of molecules. And this is what makes the diversity of life possible. So if we take a look at the carbon atom, and if you remember that the carbon atom has an atomic number of 6, which means that it has 6 protons, and that also means it has 6 electrons. And so if we draw out our electrons here, we've got 2 electrons in our first shell. We fill up that first shell. And so then we've got 4 electrons to put in our outer valence shell. And remember that the magic number for this second shell to have a full valence shell would be 8. And carbon only has 4. So carbon would like to find 4 more electrons to share with other atoms to be happy. So that means, to answer our question here, how many covalent bonds can carbon form with other atoms? It can form up to 4 covalent bonds. Okay, remember a covalent bond would be where it's sharing a pair of electrons with another atom. So carbon can form many different shapes because it can form up to these 4 covalent bonds. And it can form single covalent bonds like what we've got represented here with just a single line, or it can actually form a double covalent bond, which is these double lines here. And carbon can also form multiple branches, like in this glycogen molecule here. This is a type of carbohydrate that we actually store glucose as in our skeletal muscle and in our liver. And then it can also form these ring shapes. So glucose is actually a ring shape in our cells. So many of our macromolecules are polymers, and a polymer is just a long molecule that's made up of many monomers. And a monomer is just a subunit or building block that makes up the polymer. So if we look at that word monomer, mono means one and mer means part. And so if you just take a bunch of monomers and then just join them together by covalent bonds, that will make up your polymer. So if we answer this question down here, which macromolecules are polymers? So all of our macromolecules are going to be polymers except for the lipids. So all except the lipids. Okay, so to remember that, sorry this is in red, forgot to change color. The lipids actually are not made of polymers because the lipids are a pretty diverse group, and there's no one monomer that will make up all the lipids. So the lipids are actually not considered polymers, but all of the other macromolecules, the proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, those actually are polymers. So let's just take a look at an example here. At the bottom, we've got our protein, this long molecule here. and this would be our polymer. And what's making up the polymer, our protein, in purple, the individual subunits are actually amino acids. And those amino acids are going to be joined together by these covalent bonds to make up our polymer, our protein. So the monomers that make up the protein would be the amino acids. So this is really important to know. So we've got our 3 macromolecules that are polymers. And remember that the lipids, they are macromolecules, but they actually are not polymers. Okay, so let's just take a look at these macromolecules up here, the carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids that actually are polymers. And let's list out the monomers, the building blocks or subunits that make up the polymer for these particular macromolecules. So for carbohydrates, their monomer or building block would be a monosaccharide. So mono just meaning one and saccharide meaning sugar. And then for proteins, we talked about their monomer would be the amino acids. And then for nucleic acids, their building block or monomer, they're called nucleotides. Okay, so I would know the name of the polymer and the name of the monomer that makes up that polymer, because that's a pretty easy test question. Okay, we have 2 different types of chemical reactions that are used to make and break down the polymers. So if we want to synthesize or make a polymer, we're going to use a dehydration synthesis reaction. So the way that you remember that one is if you look at the name, dehydration synthesis, it actually has synthesis in the name of the reaction. So that means you're going to be making the polymer. You're going to be actually removing, dehydrating, you're going to be removing a water molecule to make that covalent bond and join the monomers together to make the polymer. And then to break down the polymer, you're going to be adding a water molecule, that's what the hydro is referring to. And then lysis means to break apart or split. Okay, so that would break apart the polymer into the individual monomers. Okay, so here's the dehydration synthesis reaction. So we're going to be synthesizing or making a polymer. So we've got a polymer started over here. We've got 3 monomers put together. And here's a monomer that we want to add on to our growing polymer. And so we're just going to remove a water molecule. So we're going to squeeze that out. We're going to dehydrate it. And then that will allow us to form a covalent bond and join that monomer onto our polymer chain here and make that polymer longer. And then if we want to break down a polymer, we're going to do a hydrolysis reaction. So here's our polymer up here on the top. And if we want to break one of the monomers off, we're going to add a water molecule. And this would actually be catalyzed or sped up, this chemical reaction, by an enzyme. And you can see that we would break the monomer off, and now we've got the shorter polymer, and then here's our separated monomer that we've broken off.